Next up, as far as we understand, the Russian military campaign in the Ukraine is not going according to plan. Has Putin made an enormous mistake? And if so, what should the West's response be? I'm joined now by Dr. Mike Martin, who is Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Mike, I will start with you. Quite recently you tweeted, I'm going to call this, I think the Russian armed forces are going to collapse, followed by Putin leaving power. I can't say this for certain, obviously, but I think this is the eventuality. Can you give us a bit of a breakdown as to why you think that?
I can. The first question when you're launching any kind of military action is to have your military resources matched up to your strategic goals. Putin's strategic goal here requires about 1 million troops, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government and the replacement of it by someone more favourable to Russia. They've rolled up with about 200,000 troops, so completely mismatched resources to their aims. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as has become clear to absolutely everybody, the Russian army is unable to do its own logistics, unable to repair its vehicles, has plenty of desertions, has conscripts. And that's not to say that the Ukrainians are not also suffering losses, but the Ukrainians are fighting on home territory with the support of the population, and their morale is sky high, whereas the morale of the Russians is about as low as it can get. I mean, within the last week, they've lost two-star generals, which means that something is going very, very wrong. And all of those things that I've described there, morale, equipment, and personnel, are really what makes up the fighting power of a military. And if you look at the two sides, the Ukrainians have got most of the elements of what make up the fighting power of a military, and the Russians don't. And so the question is, what happens if they do get routed in the field, or they get fought to a standstill and effectively start getting picked off to an even greater degree than they are now? Well, I think the problem is that Putin relies to a great degree on succeeding in this. And so if he fails, or at the extreme, the Russian military gets routed, as has happened in some small skirmishes, but if it happens at an operational level in Ukraine, I think Putin's days are numbered.
To what extent do you think our perspective might be warped somewhat by the fact that most of our information that we're getting is coming from Ukrainian sources, which are not always altogether reliable?
That's absolutely true. And I think that if you look at, for example, the US military's assessments of the situation, they seem to, let's just take casualties, for instance. They say that the Russians have suffered between 2,000 and 4,000 casualties, which, by the way, is much, much more than the US suffered in 20 years in Afghanistan. They also say the Ukrainians have suffered approximately similar numbers. But come back to the calculus. The Russians are working at the end of their supply lines in hostile terrain, and the Ukrainians are operating on home ground with, I mean, it's a country of 44 million people. We have an armed forces of, let's say, 350,000 plus territorial defense units and so on and so forth. There is a much more, the supply of labor for the Ukrainians is much greater than that available to the Russians. So even if it was a 1-for-1 attrition rate, the Ukrainians would eventually win that mathematical contest.
Peter, let me bring you in. We've heard a fair bit in recent days about Putin's hubris, how he's miscalculated greatly. Are you beginning to get a bit concerned that there's a little bit of Western hubris creeping into the conversation here?
No, not so far. I mean, the action by Putin was plainly mad and was almost certainly would have been opposed by almost all of his closest advisors who have any sense if he'd shared it with them. It has all the characteristics of a flailing last throw by somebody who's lost all sense of reality. And it's not surprising if it goes wrong. I don't know how wrong it's gone or how wrong it will go, partly because I don't actually know what the actual objective of the attack was supposed to be in the first place. I've never been able to work that out. Does he seriously want to take the whole of Ukraine and hold it down? How could he do that anyway? One of the things which fascinates me is in my long arguments over the years with the new Cold War merchants who've been saying we've got to be prepared for Russia to behave badly. I've said over and over again, Russia has an economy the size of Italy, and its armed forces aren't up to much. I would have thought that a large part of my position has been demonstrated as factual by this performance. It's not a first-rate army as far as one can see, nor, as has been rightly said, is it big enough for any of the tasks it might have been set out to do. So I would have thought it's hubris. On the other hand, in general, it's always wise to stick to what you actually know, and I'm not at all sure we actually know very much about this war at all. The amount of first-hand reporting, though heroic where it appears, is very small, and the knowledge that we have, I don't know. I've been brought up over the years not entirely to trust intelligence service accounts of what's going on and wait to see what really happens. But I just don't think that Russia was ever powerful enough to seize Ukraine and hold it, and I don't think it is now. And I suspect that what we're discovering is that its military forces are not that good and have not improved all that much from the time when they were that awful bunch of drunks who pretty much massacred everyone in Chechnya. So I don't know, but I don't think it would necessarily be hubristic to say, judging by their performance so far, they're not doing very well.
Were you surprised, Peter, when you talked about intelligence being doubtful? It seemed that Western intelligence, particularly American intelligence, was absolutely spot on, certainly to my surprise, about Putin's plans for invasion.
Well, exactly, and isn't that such a shock after all the rubbish they've been talking for the past 30 or 40 years over and over again for them actually to get something right? You must forgive those of us who weren't entirely convinced by it. It's not a thing that intelligence is habitually good at. So yes, so congratulations to them. They got one right. Let's see if they can keep it up.
Mike, yesterday President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke by video link to the House of Commons to sort of rapturous applause. Do you worry, perhaps, that we are getting a little bit? Obviously, we are on Ukraine's side, but perhaps that the political class in this country is becoming a little bit blind as to the reality because we're getting slightly swept up in cheerleading the Ukrainian effort?
Well, I mean, I don't think the political class is up to much in the country at the moment. I think there's a bigger question about Ukraine, which is what's the strategic outcome that we want? We've spoken plenty about what Putin's strategic aims are, but it seems to me that in the same way that Putin wanted to redesign the European security order, so do we, actually. The outcome that we want from Ukraine is, I think, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine being respected, of course, but actually I think we want a bit of a redesign of the European security order, and that probably involves Putin not being part of that. Now, how we achieve that goal, exactly how you apply leverage, obviously, a change of leadership in Russia is an affair for the Russians, but of course we can apply leverage to that. I think that really must be the outcome of this conflict. And what is more, every action that the West, that Nato, that the US takes here is being watched by China. So we have to not only solve the global, the sort of regional security challenge here, but we have to have an eye on the global security architecture, because China will be looking very carefully at what's going on here. So this recent kerfuffle over MiGs, will they, won't they? Because someone said on Twitter, it's Schrodinger's MiGs. That's watched by China and thinks, interesting. So if you do go in, 10 days later, they'll be very unified for the first 10 days, and then they'll start arguing over things like MiGs. I think we need to be very, very, very careful about things like that. There's a lot more than Ukraine at stake here. We're talking not just about the regional, but also the global security order. And so we have to get this right. And I do worry that the quality of leadership that we have at the moment, specifically in the UK, probably is not able to think in big picture terms and understand exactly how to influence the micro. By that, I mean what's happening in Ukraine to achieve the grand strategic outcomes that we want.
Peter, what do you think the grand strategic outcomes are, the ones that we want?
Well, I don't know. What I want and what the United States want, for instance, might be different things. But the thing is, the invasion has changed everything now. I think it's almost certainly made Putin's actual objective impossible, which is he had hoped to avoid the implementation of the Brzezinski doctrine, which is if you can take Ukraine away from Russia, Russia becomes permanently a minor power. And this isn't a matter of territory, it's a matter really of who controls Ukraine. As long as Ukraine was non-aligned, things bumped along on a relatively even keel. But since 2014, when the West backed to putsch in Kiev and installed a government which leaned very sharply to the West, Russia has been in a state of panic about this, which has now come to full fruition. But by failing to do anything about it in this mad spasm, I think probably just as Putin's actions particularly in the Lugansk and Donetsk regions and the separation of the Russian areas have made Ukraine more Ukrainian, this attack on Ukraine will make it far more likely that Ukraine will become a permanent member of the Western security and economic structure. And there's no chance at all of Russia being able to win it back by diplomacy. So he's lost that battle, and those who wanted very much to pursue the belittling of Russia, going right back to the Wolfowitz doctrine of 1992, have got their way. The chances of Russia ever rising again as even a major regional power are now pretty much done for, I think. So we've got that, and for the rest of it, I would say that a simple summary of our wisest policy, anybody's wisest policy under these circumstances, is don't interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake. It really and truly, this is a colossal mistake to start introducing no-fly zones or sending Polish MiGs to Ukraine under the circumstances would be a crazy thing to do.
Mike, do you get the impression that I mean, there are certainly people in the West who are talking about the possible involvement of Poland? There's been all the talk about the sky and the no-fly zone and all the various dangers of that. Do you think there's a danger that we will interrupt our enemy while he's making a mistake and then cause a much bigger and wider problem?
Yeah, so here's the problem. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainian civilians are dying as we speak. And I don't know, we might get to a point where 100,000 Ukrainians are dead within a fairly short period of time, Ukrainian civilians. We've just seen a maternity hospital has been bombed. Now, the problem is that grand strategy doesn't actually care about such things, as reprehensible as that is. And I know that this is an unpopular view. The problem is that the Western politicians responding to pundits and political pressure may indeed do something stupid that is counter to what their grand strategic interests are. And so to take some of these examples, no-fly zone, nuts. Just work out exactly how to apply leverage on Russia without giving them excuses to up the ante. Poland getting involved over these MiGs. I mean, the irony is the MiGs have a marginal at best military benefit. Very difficult to get them over there and all the rest of it, and marginal. Far more useful would be a lorry load of anti-tank missiles, as we've seen, right? All the Russian convoys are strung out, having great effect. And you only need one bloke or woman with an anti-tank missile to cause absolute havoc. So far more useful. And so the only possible reason to do these MiGs is to have a kind of political signaling effect. And that would be some sort of, basically it sends a signal that we're unified, we're pulling together, we're swapping out MiGs for US F-16s, we're sending the MiGs to Ukraine. It sends this kind of, NATO is unified signal to Russia. But the way they've handled it is sent exactly the opposite signal. So we need, and again, I sort of worry, comes back to, I think, a quality of political leadership question that I mentioned earlier.
Peter, if NATO is invigorated, is that bad news?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, since
No, I think you're the right person.
Long believe that NATO should have been wound up in 1991, and its continued existence has been a menace. I would say that these events, predicted as they were by George Kennan in 1998, more or less, and by Yegor Gaidar, the Russian liberal politician, and by many, many other experts on strategy, said if you expand NATO, if you push NATO towards Russia, you will cause the most terrible problems, and you will create in Russia a resurgence of revanchist opinion, and indeed, by implication, you'll create someone like Vladimir Putin. Well, we've done that now, and as it happens, it appears that we might be going to get away with it without too much terrible damage. The point about the civilian casualties is well made, but my view is that if you intensify war, there will be more of those casualties. A no-fly zone, for instance, would undoubtedly lead to many, many more casualties, and almost certainly beyond the borders of Ukraine. Any sort of widening of the war would be likely to do that. I would very much hope that we could find at some stage fairly soon a way in which we could end the slaughter altogether. The real danger is that Ukraine now slips into a condition of permanent war, that the Russians won't leave, that no deal is done, that nobody wants to compromise, that all its major cities become permanent sort of Fallujahs, and people just die and die and die, and millions of people have to become refugees, perhaps for the rest of their lives, or corpses. And what would be the point of that? I think there has to be a moment at which we have to consider what is the how many Ukrainians we're prepared to sacrifice for the purposes of our pride in refusing to make any kind of deal, and obviously in saying, look, you attacked, you're in the wrong. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't desire peace for the human beings who actually live in Ukraine, which I think any Christian person does, and any civilized person does.
May I respond to just some of Peter's points, Freddy? Would that be okay?
Of course you can. Yeah.
So on the question of NATO expansion, obviously we're all familiar with these arguments, but that presupposes that the traditional buffer states, if you like, in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Poland, Ukraine, etc., don't have a say in the matter. And quite clearly, all of them want to be part of NATO. They don't want to be dominated by Russia. So this sort of, Yalta-esque napkin, we're going to draw a line and keep you guys buffer states, irrespective of whether you want to be members of NATO or the EU, I think undermines one of the central planks, if you like, that makes the West attractive, which is democracy, people get to choose, and so on and so forth. On the question of how many people in Ukraine need to die, respectfully, I'm not sure that that's a question, because in the sense that if we don't get this right, if we don't get the security order right, we may well be sending British people to die. And the question for our leaders in Britain, and their job, of course, is to protect the interests of Britain and British people, is that we should not be getting ourselves into situations where perhaps British people are going to die.
Peter, let you respond to that.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. I'd be appalled if British military personnel got directly involved in this, and at the moment I can see no possible justification for it. Going back for a moment to the NATO question, if you really believe that, then presumably you'd be arguing for Taiwan to be given membership of NATO, which nobody would do, because it would be obviously a stupid thing to do. As it happens, we in the West don't even recognize Taiwan as a country, let alone allow it to join any alliances, because we're too scared of China. The whole history of NATO expansion is that it was not, the idea that was demanded by the nations involved is pretty slender. It was rammed through the Senate in the late 1990s by Bill Clinton and a load of neocons, and also with a huge amount of very heavy lobbying by American arms manufacturers. This isn't some sort of socialist worker stuff. All this was reported at the time by the New York Times, about the same time that I didn't interrupt you, about the same time that George Kennan came out of retirement to say, for heaven's sake, don't do this stupid thing. The three Baltic republics gained their independence from Russia in 1991, and they did not enter NATO for several years after that, during which I know of no material threat ever made to their independence. The whole thing that it was demanded by these poor countries left in limbo is pretty thin. The truth that it was very seriously warned against by intelligent, highly pro-Western strategists who thought that it was a foolish action on our own account is beyond dispute. I can think of no other cause in history that could conceivably unite Noam Chomsky and Henry Kissinger, but both of them say that the expansion of NATO was a stupid thing to do, and they're both of them right.
I'm so sorry, I wasn't interrupting. I was actually saying I was agreeing with you at the time.
You can interrupt me to agree with me, that's okay in future, but I didn't think necessarily what you were going to do. People don't often do that.
One very small point on Taiwan. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so to have Taiwan as a member would be a bit crazy.
Well, you say that, but if I could just point out...
Sorry, 2 seconds, sorry.
So it's a very important point here.
Sorry, if I may, hang on, if I may, if you're not interrupting. What we have seen recently, though, is actually we've seen a slow edging towards the integration of Taiwan within an East Asian alliance system. So we've actually seen recently Japan, who, of course, does have a pretty robust security treaty with the United States. Japan has recently said that Taiwanese keeping Taiwan separate from the People's Republic of China is in its national security interest. So it won't have made those announcements without first coordinating with the US. And you can start to see an almost World War I-esque chain of alliance systems in East Asia that, although there isn't a NATO type structure, actually we're starting to get to the point now where, with all these alliances being triggered, the US is going to be dragged into a fight over Taiwan.
That's very heartening to know, he said sarcastically. A First World War system of alliances is what we really need. But the point about Taiwan not being in the North Atlantic would be terrific if Afghanistan were in the North Atlantic, or if Libya were in the North Atlantic. But NATO operations have taken place in both those places, and to claim that it's limited to that area is, I'm afraid, rather out of date. There's absolutely no reason why an organisation that can put a force into Afghanistan couldn't incorporate Taiwan.
This is a tremendous discussion. Sadly, I'm being told we have to wrap it up. I would actually like to ask you both a question. I mean, a sort of neat solution for a lot of people, as far as I can see it, is that Putin is somehow removed or got rid of one way or the other. Can we be sure, Mike and Peter, can we be sure that what comes after Putin would be better as far as the West is concerned?
No, absolutely not. Could be much worse. There are all kinds of horrible things lurking in Moscow which could result from this. Don't by any means be confident that you're going to get anything better.
Mike?
And it's great because Peter and I can finish on agreement.
We'll finish it there.